I don't even know if there's a video.
Hello, everyone. Is this working? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Shayna Sadai. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'd like to welcome you all to the Cryosphere Pavilion. This is an event being put on by the British Antarctic Survey on our changing Arctic Ocean. I also would like to welcome those watching virtually, including those at the Scotland and Geneva hubs. And I'd now like to turn it over to our first speaker, David Thomas. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for turning up, and thank you for those of you who are watching virtually. I'm going to introduce the afternoon to you and to the program, and then we're going to talk about the science that has been done since 2015 as part of the NERC and the BMBF funded Changing Arctic Ocean program. So I'm meant to be the warm-up act, and then we'll go into the real science afterwards. So a couple of points. I'm going to talk about a connected Arctic in a changing world, and that's basically the theme that I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. There's a tendency to look at the Arctic as a self-entity. We talk about we're going to the Arctic, but of course the Arctic is very much more complex than that. It's land, it's oceans, it's rivers, it's estuaries, it's permafrost, it's rivers, I've already said, and it's people as well. So it's not like the Antarctic where there's no people and there's no rivers. It's a complex place, and it's this idea that the Arctic is just a one entity is largely due to said by people who aren't associated with it, or countries not associated with it. But I even live in Finland, and the south of Finland, which is an Arctic country, doesn't really understand what's going up in the north in the Arctic realms of Finland. So it can be even very closely that people don't understand the issues. The traditional view is that the Arctic is isolated. And I like this figure a lot because you can see this wave of human habitation on the outside of the Arctic Circle, which is the circle that we've drawn in here, basically pushing up against the Arctic Circle. And I guess the idea is as the Arctic changes increasingly in coming years, that circle of population is going to be moving up even more so as well. So it's clearly not isolated. Here I've just put a blob over the Arctic Circle. The Arctic Circle has a huge connected perimeter, about 16,000 kilometers of connections. Most of them are actually on land. So in this short, brief introduction that I'm going to give you, I want to just talk about the ways in which the Arctic is connected, and this point of what happens in the Arctic in a changing world doesn't just stay in the Arctic. It's not isolated, and the whole of the globe feels the impact of climate change that is going on in the Arctic. The rate of change in the Arctic is fast, and we all kind of know that, but we're going to labor on that a little bit in this talk. And the key point that I'm going to end on, and if I say nothing else, I think this is the most important point, the change is happening so rapidly, it is so fast, that I think we really have to rethink the ways that we fund, the way that we do our science, and certainly the way we put our science into policy as well. There's got to be a radical culture change, if you like, both by the scientists doing climate research in the Arctic, but also in the funders and the policymakers that need those kind of results. So the Arctic Ocean is a Mediterranean ocean. That just means that it's surrounded by land. And there's kind of two connection points, the Bering Strait and the Fram Strait down here at the bottom. And you would say, well, that looks pretty isolated to me. But it's when you consider that there's a whole load of water entering into the Arctic, this warm water that enters in from the North Atlantic into the Arctic, where it is transformed, largely by the formation of ice formation, into cold, dense water when it flows back out of the Arctic as well. So there is a massive connection. And if you look at this connectivity through the Fram Strait in a vertical slice, you have the warm surface water that is flowing northwards. It gets cooled, it forms this dense water that flows up, back out, down into the North Atlantic as deep water, deep, cold, dense, salty water. Now, The overflow down this deep rise is about 3.5 million meter cubed of water per second. Now, that's an impossible number to kind of comprehend what it really is about. But if you compare it to the Amazon, which is about 209,000 meter cubed per second, you get some kind of concept that this is a massive volume of water that is flowing back out of the Arctic and, of course, has to be flowing into the Arctic as well. There's a huge connection where you say, well, David, that's all very interesting. What does that mean? Well, this is helping drive, this is a traditional, rather an old-fashioned view of ocean circulation, but it shows that the world's oceans are connected, and this kind of warm water up in the Arctic that is being cooled is helping to drive the ocean circulation that we see and have known for a long time. So what is happening in the Arctic helps drive ocean circulation from the rest of the globe. You can see that even more in this, this Spielhaus projection, where you see this connectivity of the world's oceans very nicely. So what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, it drives ocean circulation. Let's go on to another kind of conductivity, the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is one of the most remarkable birds. It's one of the most remarkable migratory birds that we have on the planet. And there, a tern has 80,000 kilometers of conductivity every year. In the autumn, post-breeding, it migrates down to the Antarctic, where it spends the Antarctic summer in the winter, December to March, and then in the April to May, it does a northwards migration back up to the Arctic as well. So we have, through the biology, through an organism, we have the whole of the globe is kind of connected through the migration of the Arctic terns. Not just terns, but grey whales as well, mating and calving down here, and then migrating up to the feeding grounds of the Arctic every year as well across the US coast. So we have the connectivity of the ocean circulation. We have connectivity through birds, and we have connectivity through grey whale migration as well. What happens in the Arctic does not just stay in the Arctic, it has implications for a very wide, broad range of issues. Now, Arctic river catchments, and here you see these catchments of the big main rivers in the Arctic, are arguably some of the places where the most fundamental climate changes or associated changes are taking place. And it's a connection between the catchment and the coastal waters. But one of the main things about Arctic Ocean circulation is we have a big connector across the Arctic Ocean, which is called the Arctic Transporter Drift, which is indicated by this arrow here. So stuff that is going on here is transported down to the Fram Strait through this transpolar drift. So a huge connectivity through ocean circulation. Now, just stepping back a little bit, we know that associated with these big river catchments is, of course, these big soil reserves that are up high in the Arctic. So keep the river catchment picture in your eye, keep the soil reserves that are around the Arctic Ocean in your eye as well, and then also keep permafrost. And this is a map of permafrost that is in the Arctic, again heavily associated with the catchments and heavily associated with the soils as well. And so where I'm getting to with this is we have permafrost soils, we have the Arctic Ocean, we have across the Arctic, we have the catchments, we have the Arctic Ocean, and then we have the global circulation that are all really remarkably connected in a big way. So if we're getting movement of permafrost and we're getting transport of soil due to that permafrost thaw into the Arctic catchments, it's going to be transported across the Arctic Ocean and then into the global ocean afterwards. The same with pollutants as well. So we all know the Norlist spill of millions of tons of diesel. We know that. So again, you can take the same schematic. The implications of something that's happening deep in the Arctic is going to have widespread global implications as a result of that as well. Not just oil. This is a study that was done looking at, it's a desktop study, but it's looking at plastic pollution in the Arctic as well. And again, the same transport of plastic pollution or plastic particles through this transport system is being well documented and is a huge implication for what is going on. Now, the rapidity of the change is huge. So I'm going to take sea ice as an example, but we're all fundamentally aware of the wildfires that took place all summer. We're all aware of the changes in the permafrost that we're seeing almost daily records of. But sea ice is something I'm a bit more familiar with. When I started my career, it was in the early 1990s, and most of the sea ice was actually 1 to 2 to more than 4 years old. So it was thick multi-year ice, or at least 50% was, and only 60%, 50 to 60% was 0 to 1 years old. Now, the latest results are showing there's very little old ice, very thick ice left, and that most of the ice is 0 to 1 years old. So we're getting a whole change in the thickness and the age of the ice that is dominating the Arctic system. And you can see this in the ice extent as well. So it's not just the thickness and the age, but we see these decreases. So the gray line there is the average between 1981 and 210. So it's not the average, it's the median. Here we see the record low in 2012. We see last year's record in green, the 2020 line, and we see this year's in blue, the 2021 line. So we can see that the extent, the thickness, and the age of the ice within the Arctic is rapidly decreasing at a rate that is quite astounding. You know, it's happened in my lifetime. So the papers that I read when I started as a sea ice researcher are quite null and void. The textbooks that I started writing 10 years ago, we've had to rip up those sections because they are no longer valid. A book that we published this year, 2021 February, it's no longer valid, any of the comments on sea ice, because it's changing so rapidly. So this rapidity of change is something that we're finding difficult to keep up with as scientists, let alone the policymakers that are trying to put our science into policy. So I'm going to end with, basically, I could have just put this slide up here, basically, and left it at this. The rapidity of change requires that scientists and funders and governments actually rethink the way that the scale of funding we're putting into it. And this isn't just a scientist that's asking for more cash. Don't believe me, although that would be nice. But we need to change the way we're doing our science. We need to think about the ways we're funding our science. We need to think about ways of reporting our science. The traditional ways of reporting science through writing it up, doing a project, writing it up in a paper, going through the peer review phase, maybe getting it into a book chapter, getting it into an IPCC report. That scale and that extent of reporting is just too long. The changes are taking place within that reporting period. And we need to find different ways of discussing the findings as well. We are in an emergency. The Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. And now that's a huge statement that we're making here. And that means that we've got to put an appropriate response in place. We had to do it for COVID-19. We had to do it for the pandemic. The whole of the world changed the way it did its science. The whole of the world changed the way it reported its science and the way it put science into practice. Well, how much more important is it that we do it for the Arctic Ocean, or the Arctic in general, to be quite honest? It's not just an Arctic Ocean. It is absolutely fundamental that we change the way that we do it, and only then will we be able to get the answers that we clearly need. Right. I've finished my part, and we're now going to go into a little bit more of the science. Henry is going to introduce the scientists that have been taking part in this Change of Arctic Ocean program, and then we'll take it from there. And then hopefully there'll be time for questions afterwards.
David, thank you very much indeed for giving us that overview of the Arctic, about what's happening in the Arctic, some of the changes and some of the connections. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing in response to that, and in particular, a program that was created between the UK and between the UK and Germany, the Changing Arctic Ocean program. So my name is Henry Burgess. I'm from the Research Council Arctic Office, which is hosted by the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge. Our job is to make the kinds of connections with other researchers in the UK and internationally that mean that the kind of studies and investigations that David was saying we need so urgently can actually happen. So I particularly want to talk about this program, the Changing Arctic Ocean program, implications for marine biology on biogeochemistry. And this is a new program that was started back in 2015, and it's a joint program between the UK and Germany, between the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK and BMBF in Germany. It was £20 million, a really big investment in Arctic ocean science, and it was a 5-year program, dual funding from the UK and Germany, with 32 research institutions and over 200 investigators. And you can see the logos there of some of the institutions and partners who were involved. And this, if you don't know Arctic research, you might think this is what should happen. And you're right in that this is what should happen. But programs at this scale are still relatively unusual. So this kind of depth and pace of research is something that we're proud that we're able to support, and is the kind of area that we're keen to see more of in the future. This particular program was answering these two questions: getting a better quantified understanding of what was happening in the Arctic Ocean, particularly in the ecosystems, that thinking about what's happening in the bottom of the ocean, right through the water column to the sea ice and then beyond. And then thinking about what the sensitivity is of those systems to change. So getting better an understanding of the multiple stresses, and then hoping to make the models better, basically. So finding out more about what's going on so that we can predict and protect against change more accurately in the future. I won't go through all the projects in detail because you're going to hear from some of the people that are responsible for the project, and they're much better to hear about on the science than I am. But these were the first of the 4 main programs that started back in 2017, looking at sea ice, looking at changes in those Arctic ecosystems, thinking about how what happens at the top of the ocean affects the seafloor, particularly carbon sequestration, and then thinking about Calanus, which is a key Arctic species, a key kind of base of the food chain. And then we had a range of other projects as well that came on the following year, looking at an even broader range of aspects of Arctic science and change. And that issue that David was talking about, that connectivity between problems, between issues in the Arctic, is just what these kinds of projects were designed to address. So as I said, it was a heavily international program. There were 15 countries involved, as well as the UK and Germany. Lots of partners across the world. But one of the things that I wanted to stress before I finish was it wasn't just international teams that were working in the projects themselves that were funded, but because it was such a heavily international and cooperative science program, we were able to leverage further support from outside the program as well. So the program relied very heavily on cruises, and we used the James Clark Ross, the British research icebreaker, for many of those cruises. But actually the majority of the cruises, the majority of the access was not facilitated on a British ship or on a German ship, but was on ships from Norway and Canada and the USA and Russia and South Korea as well. And that's the kind of leverage you can get with other countries in a good way when you have these kind of programs at scale. So many of the findings you will hear about later on in the session have become about partly because of the funding from the UK and Germany, but also partly because of the generosity, the connections, the skills that we've been able to leverage from other countries. And that makes this a truly global effort. And it's tackling problems at scale that require that kind of global effort. So I will leave it there, and I will introduce Carly Campbell, who was one of the scientists on the Diatom Arctic project. And Carly will talk in detail about some of the findings from one of those projects that I mentioned. So, Carly, thank you very much, and over to you.
So as Henry mentioned, my name's Carly Campbell, and I'm a member of the Changing Arctic Ocean program as a lead investigator on the Diatom Arctic project. This has been a project that's been looking at microbial life in arguably one of the harshest environments on Earth, and that is the sea ice covering the Arctic Ocean. Today, I'm going to take the opportunity to provide a bit of context around primary producers as the foundation of marine ecosystems, and in particular to highlight the critical importance of thinking about sea ice when we talk about primary production in the Arctic. So this is a video showing satellite-based measurements of chlorophyll A in the North Pacific from 2002 to 2015. Where you have more green, you have more chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is broadly used to represent the abundance of primary producers in our global oceans. That is, the abundance of microorganisms with the capability to use light energy in order to make their own carbon compounds. And what you can see as the blue ocean turns to green, we have a strong seasonality in the growth of these primary producers. And if you direct your eyes northwards, you also see the growing and the retreat of white. This is the sea ice maximum and minimum extent in the Arctic Ocean. Now, for some portion of the year, a significant portion of the Arctic Ocean is influenced or covered by sea ice. And this has strong implications for the growth conditions of primary producers that are there. For example, the ability of light to go through the snow-covered sea ice into the ocean below. But the presence of sea ice also presents new opportunities for colonization by specialized microorganisms. So it is in itself a habitat. Now, primary producers take up carbon dioxide and then release oxygen through the process of photosynthesis, effectively allowing us and our planet to breathe. And on a global scale, primary producers are fixing on the order of 50,000 teragrams of carbon per year. This is more than 5 times our global emissions of CO2 from fossil fuels alone. If we focus now on the Arctic, this is more on the order of 400 to 500 teragrams of carbon per year. And to also put that number into perspective, this is about the same of driving the average EU petrol car around the globe about 90 million times. And the reason I throw those numbers at you is to put it into context further the critical importance of algae and other primary producers, as well as bacteria, in influencing the global movement of carbon dioxide. Now, as the title of this talk suggested as well, primary producers are critically important to providing the basis of marine ecosystems. That is, in fixing and providing organic carbon that provide a food resource to aquatic systems. And this is shown here for the Arctic marine system. In turn, this supports globally important fisheries, such as polar cod, as well as culturally important species like the ring seal I also shown here. Now, conceptually, we can put this another way. Imagine that this is your home, and primary producers are what are providing the critically important foundation of that house on which you can build the rest. Now, in the Arctic, we need to consider that primary producers can exist in ocean water as well as in the ice. And proportionally, this is also represented on our conceptual house here. The contribution of under ice phytoplankton, so these are in the ocean water under sea ice, is highlighted in yellow. The contribution of sea ice algae, so these are the organisms living within the ice, are in blue. And you can see that proportionally they contribute far less to total productivity of the Arctic marine ecosystem than open ocean phytoplankton. So these are the drifting algae in our greater oceans. But the unique characteristics or conditions of these ocean versus ice habitats select for a unique species of algae. And in the context of sea ice, the dark conditions, the cold conditions facilitate the growth of algae that are particularly rich in something called polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs. And these are critically important to providing a healthy ecosystem. They're a healthy lipid resource that supports small grazers to fish and ultimately large mammals like our beloved polar bear. Now, you can get the presence of each of these groups of primary producers throughout the year, but typically we have a seasonal transition from ice algal growth in the early spring to growth of under ice blooms before sort of the taking over of open ocean phytoplankton. Now, sea ice is a prominent feature in the Arctic, and seasonally it can cover between 6 and 16 million kilometers squared of the Arctic Ocean surface. That means that seasonally it represents one of the largest habitats on Earth. And this habitat provides a number of services that support human well-being, and these are broadly referred to as ecosystem services. In the context of primary production, we can focus on 3, and those are listed here. So in terms of habitat or supporting services, this goes back to this idea as a foundation of the Arctic marine ecosystem. In providing that organic carbon, it's supporting the health of a multitude of other organisms within that system. And the timing at which this carbon is provided is important. Ice algal blooms are kickstarting essentially the primary productivity to the Arctic Ocean. The second ecosystem service then to mention is in terms of provisioning. And we can think in terms of bioprospecting. That is, there is opportunity to discover and to utilize compounds within these microorganisms to support commercially viable products. For example, the production of cold-adapted enzymes in ice algae may be of interest to food preservation industries. And finally, in terms of regulating processes, it's through this activity of fixing carbon dioxide that we can influence climate relevant gases, yes, like CO2, but also others that you might have heard about, such as DMS or DMSP, which in turn impacts the formation of clouds in our atmosphere. Now, sea ice can also be designated as an ecologically or biologically significant area, or EBSA. And this is based on criteria of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this criteria is summarized in the table here. Essentially, it can be used as a means of identifying important goals for conservation and management of systems or habitats in this case. So once again, bringing it back to sea ice, we can summarize it in the following way. Sea ice is a unique habitat. It's also home to or supports growth of a range of equally unique organisms, from microscopic to the megafauna. In the same way, these organisms are highly specialized to living in association with the ice, and this makes them especially sensitive to change. As we can all imagine, if your habitat is ice and your climate is warming, this is a habitat that is certainly under threat. Now, as David introduced, there is polar amplification of global warming. That is, places like the Arctic are warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. And this has a broad range of implications. In the context of sea ice, it has already changed the aerial coverage, the volume of ice that is covering the Arctic, and the type or the age of ice that is present. Shown here is the type or age of sea ice cover between March in 1984 and March in 2018. And what I'd like to draw your attention to then is that we have an overall transition from a darker color. This is ice on the order of 3 to 4 years old, this multi-year ice that David mentioned, to a younger, more seasonal ice cover that melts and reforms every year. And to put this into a bit of perspective, I'll also draw your attention to the two photos I provide here. So this is me in a slightly different outfit, out sampling sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. The one on the left, you'll see I'm holding a coring device to take sea ice from a multi-year ice flow. On the right, the same coring device, but shorter because I'm sampling a first-year ice flow. That's because the shift in this ice type is really representing a change in thickness on the order of 4 to 5 meters to around 1 meter. Now, these changes in sea ice that are occurring very rapidly already have a measurable impact on the net primary productivity of the Arctic Ocean. Overall, we're seeing an increase in the net productivity of this system, and that is largely driven by the growth of phytoplankton, which is highlighted in red. The growth of ice algae, although we can say overall it's a growth, it's much more variable, and this has a lot to do with regional variability, for example, between the continental shelves and the central Arctic Ocean. But bringing this back to our conceptual Arctic marine ecosystem, what this all represents is a collective increase in the foundation of our ecosystem. Again, this increase in the foundation is being driven predominantly by the growth of open ocean phytoplankton. The last thing I'd like to mention about primary producers before I conclude is in the idea of biodiversity. So sea ice, and in particular multi-year sea ice, has been documented to be host to a range of unique species. It has high biodiversity. And this is represented in the figure here, where we have a measure of biodiversity on the y-axis, for multi-year ice in dark blue, for first-year ice, that's that annual ice melting, reforming every year in light blue, and then phytoplankton in the other two colors. And so what you can see is that we have highest biodiversity, certainly in the old ice, the ice that we're losing rapidly. And what this all means is that as we transition from an Arctic dominated by an older, thicker, multi-year ice cover to one that is younger, we have high potential to be losing biodiversity within our communities of primary producers. Now, alongside the potential declines in biodiversity with these primary producers, we're also seeing documented shifts in the type of species that make up these communities. And I provide two examples here. The one on the left is for sea ice, and we'll bring back these photos of myself collecting ice core samples. So we have for first-year ice and for multi-year sea ice as well. And the data I present is cell abundance for one particular genre of algae that lives within sea ice, and that is Pseudonychia. The thing to note about Pseudonychia, or what makes it potentially interesting, is that it has the potential to produce a neurotoxin that's often associated with shellfish poisoning. It's not typically dominant in the Arctic, but if we take into consideration that the multi-year ice environment very much represents our past and the first-year ice environment is our future, this raises the question as to whether the types of species that we'll see more and more commonly in the Arctic ice are ones that we want to be there. On the right, then, the example I provide is for phytoplankton. And here I present an increase in Phaeocystis buscheri, this is this type of algae shown here, in the northern Barents Sea since 2002. And with this increase, at least for me, it raises additional questions as to whether a species like this is going to be as nutritionally valuable to the ecosystem as the organisms that it's continuing or increasingly outcompeting. So with that, I'd just like to note that there is widespread agreement that the ongoing changes in the Arctic are driving changes to the primary producers, the foundation of our ecosystems. And I've highlighted that so far, this change represents an increase in total net primary production. Though I'll also note that this increase is potentially finite, in that it is dependent on light and nutrients, similar to your house plants at home might be if you remember to water them at least. That is, we will always have the polar day, and we will always have the polar night. And so the amount of light seasonally is always going to be limited. At the same time, the availability of nutrients entering the Arctic Ocean is not unlimited. So as we look to the future, this increase in net primary productivity overall can perhaps be thought of as at the expense of sea ice habitats and the organisms within them. And the rate at which we warm the climate, driven by our emissions, drives the rate of change in these particularly sensitive habitats. In turn, this impacts the variety of ecosystem services that they provide to us as humans. And that includes a valuable food resource that is high in lipids that supports ultimately the entire Arctic marine system. So as we look to sustainably use or develop, at least manage Arctic marine ecosystems, and this is an important sustainability goal at the UN, in the Arctic, it's important, yes, we consider primary producers in this assessment, but we also need to understand the separate yet equally critical roles of sea ice microorganisms as well as open ocean phytoplankton. So that's me. That's okay.
So now there will be a series of 6 presentations of short from some of the other projects that were taking part during the program. So if you've got time, they were recorded a couple of weeks ago, and they're in one long video.
So the question is, David, this is from Sam. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, absolutely. So the question is from Sam Jones, who is following the talk online. Found all the presentations very interesting. And Sam is saying, thinking about the rapidity of change, does this mean that we need to change how we publish? I suspect that Sam is a scientist, how we publish and how we communicate results to get things out to colleagues and the public faster to keep up.
Yeah. Okay. So the question's a really pertinent one, and I really believe it's an important one. I personally believe we have to change the total way we publish. You know, we're in an emergency, and an emergency needs emergency reporting as well. And that means that the scientists need to have a platform in which they can report their findings in a way that is credible, the way that people believe them. But the peer review process is just too slow and too tardy to enable that to take place. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but it certainly needs to be there because we just can't keep pace. Okay, so we're now going to go into the 6 presentations on the video.
Hello, my name is Youngjun Len. I am a physical oceanographer at the School of Ocean Sciences at Bangor University and the principal investigator for the Changing Arctic Oceans Peanuts project. So you've probably heard how the Arctic has been known to be greening. Well, actually something similar is happening in the oceans. You can see that the areas from turquoise to red are the areas in which both satellite observations as well as numerical models are predicting we're going to have big increases of photosynthesizing phytoplankton in the surface oceans in the future. So, is Arctic primary productivity driven by escalating Arctic nutrient fluxes? And to answer this question, we set out to measure ocean mixing, which draws deep nutrients to the surface. And the reason mixing may have an impact on nutrient fluxes is if we take a cross-section of the ocean, and this is a picture of our layered Arctic Ocean, in which you have different layers of water, such as warm, salty Atlantic origin flowing water, as well as Pacific origin water, also warm, flowing on the western side into the Arctic Ocean, and they sit at different levels depending on their density. However, primary production only takes place in the surface ocean, where the sunlight is able to be present for the photosynthesizing phytoplankton. Once that nutrient supply in the surface layer is depleted, in order to keep a bloom going, you need to provide extra nutrients from below, from the deeper layers of the Arctic Ocean, which is why we were interested in measuring ocean mixing. You can see that as Atlantic water flows into the Arctic, it kind of follows the red pathways that I've drawn on the map to the left. And as it flows into the Barents Sea, you can see its temperature has been increasing over the last 40 or so years that we've been measuring the temperature of Atlantic water. And its impact is that this blue line in the middle panel shows you the average latitude of sea ice in the Barents Sea. And in the winter, the sea ice extends to the south and retreats to the north in the summer. So this jagged zigzag pattern shows you these annual cycles in sea ice, and you can see that after about 2005, we've really had a receding of that sea ice, even in winter. And as you go further along the pathway of the Atlantic water in the Arctic Ocean, further into the eastern Arctic, you can see this blue line in the top panel shows you the depth of the top of the Atlantic water. And you can see it's also got shallower and shallower over time. All this has combined to a process known as Atlantification of the Eastern Arctic, in which we find the properties of Atlantic water, which are warm and salty, being more evident at the surface in the Arctic Ocean, which implies that the nutrients have also been drawn up together with its heat. And we have made new measurements of new mixing mechanisms that we've not seen before in the Arctic. There's a lot of detail on this slide. Don't worry about it. Just understand that in the gray areas, what we're showing you is that we've measured fast currents that seem to be associated with a breaking wave, a breaking internal wave that is propagating along the interfaces of these different layers in the Arctic. And that has broken and driven nutrient fluxes up to the surface. And all of it is driven by winds, which are able to put more and more energy into the Arctic as the ice goes away. You can see the Pacific water entering through the Bering Strait, entering the central Arctic Ocean. And as it does so, it jumps down below that cold, fresh layer. In the plume are nutrients and also phytoplankton that have already been present and grown before. As this plume subducts, it draws more mixing, drawing up nutrients from below the plume and driving up into the surface ocean above. As you can see, the plume kind of eventually becomes these big eddies that carry all that heat with them into the central Arctic Ocean, and they are likely contributing to accelerating the sea ice melt there. So what we can see here in this graph is that the shaded red peaks show you when nutrient fluxes from below are being pumped up into the surface ocean. And at the beginning of this record, which is kind of early summer, June, July, we don't need those nutrient fluxes to drive the blooms, which are shown in green. But as summer progresses, those nutrient fluxes are resulting in big peaks in primary productivity following the injection of nutrients into the surface ocean. So we do think, as a result, that the answer to the central question of peanuts is ocean mixing driving nutrient fluxes that support primary production. The answer to that is yes. The other conclusions from our result that are important for all of us are really thinking about how that heat from the Atlantic and Pacific waters are reaching the surface ocean and the impact they are having on the sea ice. Arctic sea ice is particularly important because it reflects a lot of solar radiation out into space. The other consequence of losing sea ice, when they have low summer sea ice, these low summer sea ice years have been linked to harsh winters in the following winter season across Europe and Asia. One last consequence of low sea ice that I'd like to highlight today is that low sea ice means more sunlight reaching the surface ocean. And the question of what this sunlight is doing and the consequences of that are going to be discussed now by my colleague Finlo Cottier.
Hello, I'm Finlo Cottier. I'm a professor in polar oceanography at the Scottish Association for Marine Science. I think that the continuing loss of sea ice is one of the most graphic consequences of climate disruption in the Arctic. And we've heard that heat and fresh water are critical parameters, but the sea ice acts as a huge sunshade, and loss of sea ice allows more light to enter the ocean. When you look at the ice-free Arctic Ocean, the water appears very black, so you might think it's a dark ocean. But actually, as sea ice continues to be lost from all areas in the Arctic at all times of year, the Arctic Ocean is becoming more illuminated. There is more light entering the ocean, and this inevitably has biological impacts. Light was central to a number of projects in the Changing Arctic Ocean programme, and one project that I led investigated the biological response to seasonally varying light and seasonally varying sea ice cover. The project was called Arctic Productivity in the Seasonal Ice Zone. And we don't mean productivity in the economic sense, but in the sense of a productive ocean, where the basic plant life in the ocean, the phytoplankton, take in carbon through a process called photosynthesis. The carbon is stored in the phytoplankton and transferred to other life forms, such as tiny animals called zooplankton, which then become the prey for economically and culturally significant species of fish and mammals. A key question for us was, what role does light play in different seasons? In our project, we used robotic gliders. These are autonomous vehicles that travel backwards and forwards through the ocean, rising and falling from the seabed to the surface, collecting data along that pathway. And from these measurements, we made two important scientific discoveries. The first relates to the timing of critical biological parameters, most notably the rapid growth of phytoplankton in spring, called the spring bloom. And to be able to measure this and to simulate it, we need very accurate models of the light in the ocean. And our project was able to use the glider data to create a new computer simulation of light in the ocean. And the model can start now to answer questions about whether blooms will begin earlier in the year, will they last longer, and where will they occur. And the second discovery relating to light was about the response of animals to illumination. Zooplankton are tiny animals which eat and graze on the phytoplankton, which grows on the illuminated surface. But then the zooplankton have a daily trade-off to make. How much time do they spend on the surface eating? But if they spend too much time there, they're at risk of being eaten themselves by other animals in the food chain, notably fish. And the solution is to move vertically every day through the water, migrating between the dark depths of the ocean and the illuminated surface. And our project discovered that some of the behavioral characteristics of zooplankton include seeking out darkness with safety from predators. And they do this in a very consistent way year round. And this understanding allows us to represent zooplankton in ecosystem simulations more accurately. So through our project, we now have a way of simulating light levels in the ocean, which leads to the phytoplankton blooms. And we have a way of simulating the behavior of zooplankton, which transfers the carbon from the phytoplankton into different parts of the food chain. The loss of ice for Arctic communities has lots of aspects to it. As well as a platform for travel and hunting, the loss of the shading that's provided by ice will change the relationship between marine predators and their prey. And the local food webs will inevitably respond, and historically robust food resources could be in jeopardy. And carbon flow is not just confined to the Arctic. The contribution of the Arctic to the capture, flow, burial, and release of carbon in the global system is really important. But do we really understand how the Arctic will function if we continue along this path towards an ice-free summer? I don't believe we do, and yet that's the trajectory that we're on. We have a globally important ocean with significant harvestable resources that's becoming more illuminated. And this is going to undermine the stability and resilience of the Arctic marine ecosystem. Communities and cultures are reliant on the productive Arctic Ocean, so we must act in their interests. So hopefully I've shown that light is fundamental to the productivity of the Arctic Ocean. That productivity is fueled by carbon, and ultimately much of that carbon will make its way from the illuminated ocean surface down to the seafloor.
Well, thanks very much, Finlo. So my name is Christian Merz. I'm a biogeochemist from the University of Leeds, and I'm also the principal investigator on the Changing Arctic Ocean project. We studied specifically the seafloor of the Arctic Ocean and how it would respond to ongoing climate changes. One thing that many people don't realize is that the seafloor is still a very active ecosystem, and it is a very important hub for the cycling of carbon and other nutrients, in a way very similar to your compost heap in the garden. So the seafloor receives organic material that sinks down from the water column, like you are basically shoveling kitchen waste onto your compost heap. And then there is a myriad of microbes and also little worms and other critters that dig through that material and release certain nutrients, which is what you want for your plants. But a certain amount of the organic matter, which is mainly carbon, is also then remaining in your compost heap. And these are all the factors that also impact what happens at the seafloor. So the first thing I wanted to show you is a video of the box corer that is deployed to the seafloor. It's then being pulled up, and you can see it coming down to the deck of our research ship here, the James Clark Ross. And yeah, you can see as it's being lifted, there's a gush of water, and then you have a nice block of intact seafloor in front of you. This mud is then sorted and sieved for all the little critters and animals that live there. And that gives us a picture of the seafloor ecosystem. Another tool we use, and you can see it going into the water here, is the so-called multicorer, which has a number of tubes that go into the seafloor, as you can see here. It's an instrument that really preserves the boundary between the seawater and the sediment, which is what we need for some of our research. So what we found in terms of benthic ecosystems is there is a very clear divide between the northern and the southern Barents Sea, which is basically imprinted by two different water masses sitting above the seafloor. So there's a very clear connection between what happens in the overlying water and what happens at the seafloor. And this boundary between these two water masses, the so-called polar front, is bound to shift further north. And we've already seen that over the last decades. And it affects in a very similar way the seafloor ecosystems and biodiversity, obviously. Now, another thing that is very important is the nutrients that are being released from the seafloor and the carbon that is being stored in there. Because on the one hand, the seafloor fertilizes the overlying water column. On the other hand, it is also a very important pool to store carbon that was previously sequestered by algae in the water column, then sank down to the seafloor and is now buried into the seafloor over thousands of years, as we could show. So it really sits around there and has removed permanently almost CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, one thing we looked at most recently is the effects of increasing bottom trawling on all of these things. As sea ice is retreating, especially from the shallower parts of the Arctic Ocean, there's much more fishing and trawling activity in previously pristine areas. And that really disrupts the entire ecosystems and also these carbon and nutrient cycles. And what we could definitely see and predict is, depending on how deep the trawling is and what kind of instruments you use, you're strongly reducing the capacity of the seafloor to hold carbon that was previously buried there. It's like when you're digging through your compost heap, you're exposing the organic material to oxygen, it gets degraded. That's the same thing that happens in the Arctic Ocean. You are re-oxidizing this carbon to CO2 that goes back into the atmosphere. On the other hand, you might increase, at least on the short term, the fertilization effect, because you have nutrients stored within the sediments, flushing them up through the trawling back into the water, and there they could fertilize new primary productivity and algal growth. It's still quite unknown how these processes will pan out in the future, because it's something that we're really just starting to study as the environment is changing. So in a way, we are almost trying to play catch up with how quickly the system is changing and how quickly we can study it.
Hello, my name is Claire Mahaffey. I'm a professor of ocean sciences at the University of Liverpool, and I'm the principal investigator of the ARISE project. So the Arctic Ocean is rich in life, from the remarkable microscopic plankton that live in sea and ice, right up to the whales, seals, and polar bears. Together, they make up the unique Arctic ecosystem, which supports 4 million people that live in the Arctic. So the goal of the ARISE project was to assess the impact of climate change on Arctic marine ecosystems, and also to attribute ecosystem change to drivers. ARISE focused on a specific property of an ecosystem known as a food chain, which simply describes the dependence of one organism on another as a food source. Using naturally occurring stable nitrogen isotopes, written here as 15N, we were able to quantify the variation of nitrogen isotopes in plankton at the base of the food chain and in seals. So trends in nitrogen isotopes in plankton reflect multiple drivers of environmental change, whereas estimating food chain length and trophic position of seals provides information on food web dynamics, both in space and in time. However, our planet has been warming for decades, and so we can learn a lot from looking at how marine ecosystems have changed in the past in response to our changing climate. So through international collaborations, we gained access to archives of seal tissues going back to the 1950s. So just as you can reconstruct the age of a tree using the rings in the tree, you can also reconstruct past trends in ecosystem dynamics by analyzing the stable nitrogen isotopes in seal teeth and in seal tissue. So using this novel information alongside new knowledge on the historical seal migrations from seal tags, as well as output from global numerical models, the ARISE project developed a really novel framework to assess change in Arctic ecosystems, but importantly, over decadal timescales and also at pan-Arctic spatial scales. So we used decadal trends in nitrogen isotopes in plankton to assess environmental change. In the Canadian Arctic, we observed an increase in nitrogen isotopes in plankton. And in contrast, in the Barents Sea, we observed a decreasing trend in nitrogen isotopes in plankton, both of these trends over decadal timescales. So using a global numerical model, we reconstructed past trends in isotopes in plankton, but importantly, we identified the drivers of change and also were able to then make future projections. So natural variability dominates the simulation initially, but in agreement with our observations, there's an increasing trend in isotopes in plankton in the Canadian Arctic and a decreasing trend in the Barents Sea. So sea ice loss, as well as increased primary productivity, explain the increasing trend in nitrogen isotopes in plankton in the Pacific-influenced Arctic, so the Canadian Arctic, whereas increased Atlantic inflow explains the decreasing trend in the Barents Sea region, that is the Atlantic-influenced Arctic. So what about the seals? So in the Canadian Arctic, since the 1990s, the trophic position of ringed seals decreased in the high Arctic, but remained constant in the mid-Arctic. If we contrast that to what we observe in the Barents Sea and the Labrador Sea, the trends in the trophic position in harp seals was actually non-linear in both regions. So why is this? So for ringed seals living in the Canadian Arctic, and especially in the high Arctic, it's the decline in sea ice and increase in open water days which has altered the feeding dynamics of ice-dependent zooplankton. This has shortened the food chain, driving a decline in the trophic position of ring seals. However, in the mid-Arctic, these changes to the environment have already taken place pre-1990s due to being at a lower latitude, and therefore we see no change in the trophic position of ring seals. In the Barents Sea, the non-linear decadal variation in the trophic position of harp seals may actually be linked to fish stocks, in this case capelin, with high capelin abundance driving a decline in the trophic position. So using a combination of observations, seal telemetry, and global models, ARISE has provided really robust scientific evidence for decadal scale changes in the Arctic ecosystem. Our Panarctic approach, however, has demonstrated that these changes in the ecosystem are non-uniform and instead vary between regions. We were also able to attribute the observed changes to both local and far-field drivers, but again, these drivers vary quite significantly. In some regions, it's due to the drivers are melting ice and productivity, and in some regions, it's due to the influence of the connected oceans, that is the Atlantic and the Pacific. So the Arctic ecosystem has been responding to climate change for decades, many decades, and will continue to do so. New knowledge that we get from archives alongside local indigenous communities is vital to support our short-term science-based understanding of change. So understanding the non-uniform regional response and drivers of change is vital both for Arctic communities and also management of these natural resources into the future. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Jens Strauss from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Potsdam in Germany. I am a geoecologist working on frozen grounds, which is called permafrost. Together with my colleague Paul Mann from Newcastle, I am leading the project Cocoon. With this team, we are working on the changing Arctic carbon cycle, and especially with a focus on the coastal nearshore zone. This project we are working on together is about permafrost, frozen ground, which is getting non-permanent with warming Arctic regions. Actually, this is a main challenge here for all these carbon and sediments and ice, which is in there and now getting remobilized with warming. We are looking at how much of this carbon could be mobilized and transported into the rivers in Russia, and how this is connected to the Arctic Ocean. With this huge amounts of sediments, ice and carbon eroding there, we found up to 20 meters. We have an increase of this erosion and transportation in the last decades. This eroded ancient carbon is partially of very good quality, at least from the microbial point of view, though they can use that to produce greenhouse gases. With this carbon in the water, there is breakdown. Then even this breakdown here is enhancing or speeding up processes going on in the water. This has great implications for the ecosystem. Processes like greenhouse gas productions are increasing. Also, we included a process which is called thermokarst. Thermokarst is a deep thawing process which can even more remobilize carbon which was frozen in on land. Up to 3 or 12 times more carbon we found to be prone to thaw in the future, and this future means 300 years in our case. Paired this with enhanced runoff, this means that more water is flushing down the river by more rain and snow input. We will fuel greater greenhouse gas emissions from Arctic catchments. A recent modeling approach, we were using a biogeochemical model and identified the bioradioactivity of this carbon. We found this carbon, which was coming from the land, now in the water, is a critical parameter. And this parameter is dominating the strength and the direction of the future carbon emissions from the ocean waters and the shelf region. Now, there is not necessarily the nutrient supply, which is going from the land to the waters. It's more the light penetration and the phytoplankton communities, which are influenced by this carbon. These two are the critical factors determining the oceans to be a carbon dioxide source in the future. In a nutshell, we found that there's lots of erosion and lots of stuff going on in the Arctic. So these are hotspots of change. More river runoff and more carbon from thawed permafrost may turn the Arctic rivers, the nearshore zone, and the ocean to a net greenhouse gas source in future. And this permafrost degradation is affecting also people. Like there are living 5 million people which are like built on permafrost, their cities and all their houses. And there's even more people living there when including the permafrost regions in the subarctic. With permafrost thaw and changing patterns in the ice on the rivers, on the ocean, they have disrupted access to herding, hunting, fishing grounds. And this also causes instability of agricultural land. For all the people living outside the region, there is a self-reinforcing feedback called the permafrost carbon feedback. More warming will cause more thaw, and this thaw will cause more greenhouse gas release, which will cause more warming, and so on and so forth. This means for us that every degree warming we can not do here or wherever we live avoids any can help to keep as much carbon sequestered in the Arctic as possible. And this helps to reach not the critical tipping point.
Taken together, what does everything we've heard mean for how we model ecosystem change in the Arctic and beyond? I'm Neil Bannis, an oceanographer and ecologist at the University of Strathclyde, right here in Glasgow. And I lead one of the teams in CAO that has been working on translating all these new discoveries from the field into improved computer simulations. Our goal is to bridge the gap between large-scale projections of ocean physics and chemistry on the one hand, and all the urgent questions we face about the future of commercial fisheries, traditional food and subsistence, and the conservation of whales and polar bears and seabirds. We've made a lot of progress in CAO in representing how organisms big and small depend on ice. This starts with models of how light is transmitted through all the different varieties of sea ice, and better models of how the algae that live in the ice itself respond to that. The next level of model we're developing describes zooplankton, like these calinous copepods, little crustaceans found everywhere in the Arctic at the heart of the food web. As Finlo explained earlier, zooplankton need algae for food, and so they need underwater light so the algae can grow, but they also need darkness for safety. And we're using models to understand how these conflicting needs play out as ice diminishes. These very small-scale stories don't stay small-scale. They've already started to reshape the map of where the ocean does and does not produce the right kind of plankton to feed fish. Other colleagues have been developing new ways to mathematically model how large predators like polar bears and seals use sea ice. This leads to models that can better connect the dots between climate change and our other management and policy choices. For example, how do we manage fishing in the future Barents Sea? The key result from this full food web model project based here at Strathclyde is that we should be minimizing the harvest of plankton-eating fish like herring and capelin in order to protect the upper levels of the food web like birds and mammals. This is a difficult policy trade-off, and more difficult trade-offs like it are coming to other regional seas. So the ecosystem models we're building are intended to provide specific long-range decision support. But another thing that models can help us do is think clearly across scales. One of the projects I was involved in as part of CAO was an effort to understand what Disco Bay in West Greenland means to the bowhead whales in that part of the world. Bowhead whales are the largest Arctic marine mammal, and huge numbers of them come to Disco Bay in the spring from very far away in order to feed on calinous copepods. What we discovered is that many of the copepods themselves have also come to Disco Bay from elsewhere with currents. These days, it's mainly copepods from the Atlantic, following these red pathways, not the Arctic as it would have been a few decades ago. And those same Atlantic copepods are the ones that, if they're carried in the other direction, support fisheries and seabird colonies off the coast of Ireland and Britain. And so these model-based maps are a way of reminding ourselves how literally all of these changing ecosystems are woven together at the base of the food web. But I bring up bowhead whales for another reason too, which is that they live for 200 years. And in the context of the decisions being made here at COP, I think that's a very poignant and challenging fact. It means that there are whales alive today who have been present for the entire arc from the age of industrial slaughter in the 1800s that nearly brought them to the point of extinction, through the hard-won international agreements to protect them, and now the current period of slow recovery. It also means, though, that there are whales alive today who will easily outlive the entire timeline in our model projections if we can protect the climate and ecosystems that they depend on. When we imagine the world that we are going to have in a year like 2140, at the end of the current crisis, we call it science fiction. But for the bowhead whales in the ocean today, it's just a kind of retirement planning. So I hope that as you go about your work here at COP, it helps to imagine the perspective on connection that the copepods would take, or the perspective on time that the bowhead whales would take if they could also be here.
Okay, well, I guess we've still got time for a few questions. I'm looking at the organizers at the back, but they're not saying stand down. So if there's any questions, we are happy to try and take them. No, oh, we've just been told we are not taking questions. So, okay, thanks very much for coming. We really appreciate it. And well, we'll be around for a little bit longer if you want to ask us questions directly. Thank you.
I'm happy to say that we can take questions. We just don't have any questions from online listeners. So do we have any questions in the room today? If you have any questions, please come to the microphone. And there is time, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood.
No worries.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentations. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's fine.
You mentioned in one of the pamphlets here something, a little bit of talk about working with Indigenous knowledge holders during the process of this particular project, or do you do that in general? And if so, how is it going? How are you incorporating Indigenous knowledge, and how are you working with Indigenous communities?
So one thing I must say is it was a downside of the changing Arctic Ocean problem that wasn't a component of this particular program. The successor of the Changing Arctic program has taken that on board, and we actually, working together with Canadian Indigenous populations, we are doing that. I work increasingly with Indigenous populations in Finland and the Sami people. What is very clear, and actually we can give you a link to a conversation that we had recently about exactly this issue. It was a very far-reaching discussion that we had, and something that I was really pleased to do. It's absolutely pertinent that, it's the arrogance of scientists going into populations with already formulated ideas and almost already formulated answers that they want to show, and I think arrogance is the only word, and that has to stop. And I think there's now a realization that is absolutely wrong. It's offensive in so many ways. And so I think what we're seeing now is a real acceptance of that amongst the scientists. I mean, I think the scientists, to be fair, just never were made aware. But now those channels of discussion and opportunity, and what I would really like to see is the Indigenous communities actually, they're the ones that are best able to ask some of the questions. The scientists always go in with questions, but actually we should listen to the questions that the Indigenous communities actually want to answer, how those questions are best to be answered, because again, it may not be through traditional scientific routes, and also then to give them the ownership of the results, because that's the other really worrying thing is, again, I'm going to use the word arrogance, is people go in there and arrogantly take ownership of the results, and that is just so wrong on whatever count. So it's a real embarrassment what has gone on to date. I just really hope that we're in a new way of looking at the science that needs to be done, that is giving the ownership to the indigenous communities as well. I mean, some of the words I found there are quite trite. I understand that, but hopefully you get the meaning behind the words that I use then.
I can just add a small example specific to the Diatom Arctic project, for example. Can you hear me?
No, I think you need to come over here.
I can hear myself, but no one else can hear me, I suppose. Now it's okay. I was just going to add, specific to the Diatom Arctic project that I was representing here today, we conducted fieldwork in Coral Harbor, so in northwestern Hudson Bay. And in terms of knowledge exchange and community engagement, I absolutely see that as a priority in the work that we did. And to provide some examples, we had meetings with Hunters and Trappers Organization. We built our sampling schedule and approach using Indigenous knowledge, and we had Indigenous guides to safely take us out onto their land. And as a follow-up to that, I look forward to working with the University of Manitoba very much in continuing that knowledge exchange. Now that we're just starting to work up results, it's important that you follow that through as well. And then one last example as well, I mentioned Hunters and Trappers Organization, but equally important, it's actually a really exciting opportunity also to engage the youth in these communities when you are conducting science in their backyards. And so examples of that include visiting the schools, having the kids out to the sea ice camps to see hands-on the work that we're doing. And so I think I agree with David that work, we need to do more of it. It's critically important. But I do think that there are some steps that we're taking in the right direction for it. So I think this is a really great question.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll draw a line under it. Thanks ever so much for taking the time to listening. And it looks like there's an announcement.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a really incredible and fascinating session, and we really appreciated having all of you here and the recorded talks as well. So at 4 p.m., we will be having the official opening of the Cryosphere Pavilion, and followed by that, there will be a joint event with the Cryosphere Pavilion Hub that's currently in Geneva on glaciers, snow, and water supplies. So please feel free to join us at 4 p.m. for the opening and for the remaining sessions today. And of course, all week. Thank you so much.